The grand church was bathed in soft golden light as the wedding ceremony began. The air was filled with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something magical was about to unfold. Rows of white chairs lined the aisle, each one adorned with delicate flowers and satin ribbons, creating a picture-perfect scene. The gentle murmur of the guests' voices echoed through the high vaulted ceilings, adding to the sense of grandeur. Today was a day of celebration, a day that promised joy, love, and new beginnings. The music began to play, a soft, classical tune that filled the space with a sense of romance. The bride, a stunning young woman with a radiant smile, stepped into view. Her dress shimmered as she walked, every step graceful and poised. Her veil cascaded down in soft folds, framing her face as she took slow, deliberate steps toward the altar. She was the picture of elegance, every detail perfect, from the delicate lace of her gown to the sparkling jewelry that caught the light. The guests turned to look, their faces lighting up with smiles as they took in the sight of the bride. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes never left the man standing at the front. The groom, tall and handsome in a sleek black tuxedo, stood at the altar with a look of awe on his face. His dark eyes sparkled with emotion as he watched his bride approach, a look of admiration and love in every glance. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out to adjust his bowty, but there was no hiding the joy in his expression. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would come together, and he would say, "I do," to the woman he loved. The guests stood in hushed silence as the bride reached the altar. Her father, standing beside her, took a moment to kiss her on the cheek before handing her over to the groom. The groom, in a gesture of tenderness, took her hand in his, and the priest began to speak. His voice was deep and calming, carrying through the church with a sense of reverence. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of these two souls in the sacred bond of marriage. May love, patience, and understanding guide them through the days ahead." The priest intoned, his words echoing in the quiet space. The bride and groom exchanged a look, a moment of silent communication passing between them. The groom's lips curled into a soft smile, his heart swelling with pride and joy. He could barely believe this moment had come. The woman standing beside him was his everything. She was the one who had stood by him through thick and thin, the one who had supported him when times were tough. She was his partner, his equal, and today they were about to begin the next chapter of their lives together. The bride, too, felt a sense of wonder. As she stood there, looking at the man she was about to marry, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She had dreamed of this moment for years, imagining this very day in her mind. And now it was finally here. The man she loved, the man who made her laugh, who made her feel safe and cherished, was standing beside her. And they were about to make their vows before God and all their loved ones. The priest continued with the ceremony, leading them through the traditional vows. The bride and groom repeated after him, their voices steady but filled with emotion. "I take you to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or for worse." Their words were filled with sincerity, as they spoke promises that would guide them through the years to come. The guests, seated in the pews, watched in awe. They had gathered to celebrate this beautiful occasion, to witness the union of two people who had found love and happiness in each other. Some guests dabbed at their eyes, a few unable to hide their tears of joy. The bride's mother smiled through her tears, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her daughter take this momentous step in her life. The groom's father, a man of few words, looked on with approval, his eyes filled with silent admiration for the couple standing before him. As the vows were exchanged, everything seemed perfect. The bride and groom stood together, hands clasped, hearts entwined, with the priest's blessing in the air. It was a moment of pure happiness, a moment where everything seemed aligned in the universe. There was no doubt in their minds that this was the right decision, that this was the person they were meant to be with forever. The future was bright, and the possibilities seemed endless. And then, just as the priest was about to pronounce them husband and wife, something unexpected happened. The atmosphere in the church shifted, a subtle change that no one could quite place at first. The priest, who had been smiling as he prepared to deliver the final blessing, suddenly faltered. His gaze flicked toward the groom, his brow furrowing ever so slightly. It was an imperceptible moment, but one that would change everything. Something about the groom's posture, something about the way he was standing, caught the priest's attention. A slight hesitation, a tension in his stance, something that felt off. The priest paused mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he studied the groom more closely. The room, which had been filled with nothing but joy just moments before, now seemed to hold its breath. What was happening? What had the priest seen? The tension in the air grew thicker, and for the first time during the ceremony, there was a feeling of unease that no one could ignore. The priest's next words would stop the wedding, and no one in the room could have predicted what would come next. The wedding ceremony, which had begun with such joy and expectation, now hung suspended in the air, thick with an unspoken tension. The priest, Father Thomas, stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on the groom, Michael. For a brief moment, the priest's mind wandered, as though lost in a sea of thoughts. The vows had been spoken. The bride and groom stood hand in hand, and everything was supposed to proceed smoothly. Yet there was something about Michael's demeanor that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the ceremony. As Father Thomas continued to stare at the groom, he could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. Michael's face, once filled with excitement and joy, now looked strained, almost as if he were hiding something. The small twinge of discomfort had turned into an undeniable sense of unease that Father Thomas could not ignore. There was a slight tremor in Michael's hand as he held the bride's, and the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot seemed too unnatural, too nervous for a man on the happiest day of his life. Father Thomas had performed hundreds of weddings in his years of service. He had seen couples in every possible emotional state, some filled with joy, others overwhelmed with nerves, but nothing quite like this. He had learned to read people, to sense when something was off, and he could feel that there was something hidden in this moment. His gaze didn't falter. He studied Michael more closely, trying to understand what was causing the sudden shift in his energy. The wedding guests, blissfully unaware of the growing tension, continued to smile, their eyes shining with tears of happiness. The bride, Isabella, beamed with love and anticipation, her eyes locked on her future husband. She seemed unaware of the change in the air. Everything was perfect in her eyes, and nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. The priest's suspicion grew, and with it, his concern. He paused. A slow breath left his lips. Something felt deeply wrong, but what was it? His instincts, honed over years of watching people, told him that this wasn't just a case of pre-wedding nerves. There was more, something that Michael was hiding, something that had the potential to shatter this perfect day. He stepped back slightly, just enough to create a small distance between himself and the couple. His gaze moved from the groom to the bride, his mind racing. Isabella looked so radiant, so pure in her excitement, but the priest could see the anxiety flicker in Michael's eyes. As the priest focused more intently, he noticed that Michael's eyes darted nervously toward the back of the room, toward a guest sitting in the last row, a woman whom Father Thomas hadn't noticed earlier. She was sitting alone, her eyes fixed on the groom, with an intensity that made the priest pause. Something about the woman's presence seemed out of place. She was not a part of the immediate family, nor did she appear to be a familiar face in the wedding party. Father Thomas's eyes narrowed slightly as he tried to focus on the woman's expression. There was an undeniable tension between her and Michael. Her face was unreadable, but there was a faint tightness in her jaw, a look of suppressed emotion. Father Thomas couldn't ignore the strange connection between Michael and this woman. The priest's eyes flicked back to Michael. There was something more there, a subtle but unmistakable sign of discomfort. Michael's expression hardened as he noticed the priest's gaze resting on him. The slightest frown tugged at his lips, but he quickly covered it with a forced smile, turning his attention back to Isabella. But it was too late. The suspicion had already taken root in Father Thomas's mind. It wasn't just nerves. It wasn't simply a random glance or a moment of hesitation. There was a hidden truth, a secret that had yet to be revealed. The priest felt the weight of the moment, the sense that something monumental was about to unfold. The priest turned slightly, his gaze now sweeping across the congregation. The guests continued to watch, unaware, as he spoke. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness a union of love. Michael and Isabella, as you exchange your vows, you promise to be honest, to cherish each other through the highs and the lows, for richer and poorer, in sickness and in health. I ask you now to reflect on the meaning of this vow, to remember that your bond is built on trust, faith, and honesty." As the priest spoke those words, Michael's gaze shifted again, this time not towards the back of the room, but directly at Father Thomas. There was a coldness in his eyes, a flicker of something that the priest couldn't quite place. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. The priest's instincts told him that this wasn't just a wedding. This was something much more complex, something that would change everything. Father Thomas, despite his growing sense of unease, continued with the ceremony. But as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that the groom was hiding something crucial. His eyes flickered back to the woman in the back row. Was she the key? What connection did she have with Michael, and why had he reacted so strongly at the sight of her? The air in the church had changed. The quiet whispers of the congregation, once filled with joy, had faded into a hushed silence. The priest knew that he had to act, that he had to understand what was happening before it was too late. But for now, he held his ground. He would not let this moment pass without uncovering the truth. As the ceremony continued, Father Thomas's suspicion only deepened. There was something more to Michael's story, something buried beneath the surface, waiting to be exposed. The truth was waiting to come out, and when it did, the consequences would be unimaginable. The soft murmur of the congregation faded into a heavy silence as Father Thomas stood still, his gaze fixed on Michael. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the very walls of the church were holding their breath. The priest had paused mid-ceremony, his eyes scanning the groom with a growing sense of urgency. Isabella, her hand still firmly grasped by Michael's, had no idea what was happening behind the calm exterior of the priest. She was lost in the moment, thinking only of her future and the man she was about to marry. But Father Thomas could no longer ignore what he had seen. The woman in the back of the room, the strange unease in Michael's eyes, the way he kept glancing toward her. It was all too much to dismiss as mere nerves. It was clear now that something was terribly wrong. "Is everything all right?" Isabella's voice, soft and filled with concern, broke through the silence. She looked up at Father Thomas, her eyes filled with the innocence of a bride who believed this was the most beautiful moment of her life. But there was a flicker of unease in her gaze as she noticed the priest's serious expression and the way Michael's body had stiffened. Father Thomas hesitated for just a moment before answering, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He had never interrupted a wedding in his years of service, but this was different. He knew that if he did not act, the truth would remain hidden, and the consequences would be disastrous. "I'm afraid there is something we need to address," Father Thomas said quietly, his voice steady but filled with authority. His eyes moved from Michael to the woman in the back of the room, a subtle but pointed glance that no one else seemed to notice. Isabella turned her head, her expression softening in confusion. She hadn't seen the woman, and she certainly didn't understand the look that had passed between Father Thomas and Michael. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, now filled with worry. "What's wrong?" Before Father Thomas could speak further, Michael finally broke the silence. His voice was strained, almost panicked as he turned toward his bride, trying to reassure her. "Nothing's wrong, Isabella. It's just a misunderstanding. he stammered, but there was a noticeable shift in his tone. It wasn't the voice of a man who was confident in his words. It was the voice of someone who was terrified of the truth being revealed. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so sure that this was the man she had chosen to spend the rest of her life with. But now, his hesitation, the way he was avoiding her gaze, sent a wave of doubt through her. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice trembling with confusion. The priest nodded slowly, but his gaze remained focused on Michael. "Michael, is there something you need to tell Isabella?" he asked, his voice firm but gentle, as though he were trying to give the groom a chance to come clean on his own. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Michael swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously to the back of the room again, where the woman sat, watching with an almost accusatory gaze. Isabella turned her head, following his gaze, and for the first time, she saw the woman who had been silently observing the ceremony. The woman's expression was unreadable, but there was something about her presence that made Isabella's heart beat faster. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Her eyes widened as she looked back at Michael, the truth slowly dawning on her. "Who is she?" Isabella's voice cracked as she spoke, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Her hand, still held tightly in Michael's, began to tremble. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to stick in his throat. He glanced helplessly at Father Thomas, but the priest merely nodded, urging him to be honest. The room was silent now, and all eyes were on the groom. The guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, began to stir uneasily in their seats. I didn't want you to find out this way," Michael finally said, his voice shaky and filled with regret. "Isabella, I never meant for it to go this far." The words hung in the air like poison. Isabella felt her world shatter as she stared at Michael, trying to process what he was saying. Her heart, which had been filled with love just moments ago, now felt cold and heavy. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, the silent judgment of the people she had invited to share this special day. Michael reached for her hand, his grip tight but desperate. "Please, Isabella. I'm so sorry. This isn't what I wanted, but I couldn't hide it from you anymore." Isabella pulled her hand away slowly, the shock of his words still sinking in. "You couldn't hide it from me. What are you talking about, Michael? What is she doing here?" Her voice rose in volume, filled with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. She glanced again at the woman in the back row, who was still watching them with a quiet intensity. The woman, sensing the confrontation, finally stood up. She walked toward the altar, her heels clicking sharply against the church floor. Isabella's heart raced as the woman approached. She was beautiful, confident, and there was no mistaking the familiarity in the way she moved. Isabella knew immediately that this was no stranger. The woman stopped beside Michael, her gaze shifting briefly to Isabella before settling on the groom. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice calm and steady. "I didn't want to ruin the wedding, but it's time for the truth to come out." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to spin around her as she looked from the woman to Michael, her mind struggling to piece together the puzzle. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice barely a whisper. She's the reason I've been so distant. I've been seeing her, Isabella. I never wanted you to know, but I can't keep lying to you. I've been having an affair." The words were like a dagger to her heart. Isabella's entire body froze as the reality of what Michael had just admitted sank in. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she looked at Michael one last time, the man she had thought she would marry, the man she had trusted. But now, all she felt was betrayal. You've been lying to me this whole time," she whispered, her voice filled with heartbreak. Michael nodded, his head hung low in shame. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go this far, but it did." Isabella stood there, her heart breaking with every word, every breath. The weight of the truth crushed her, And as the reality of what had just been revealed sank in, she realized that the man she thought she would spend her life with was nothing more than a stranger. The silence in the church was deafening. Isabella stood frozen, her heart shattered, her mind swirling with a mix of disbelief, confusion, and heartbreak. The weight of Michael's betrayal, the deep sense of loss, and the realization that everything she had believed in was a lie pressed down on her like a heavy burden. Her body trembled, her hands shaking, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not now. Michael stood beside her, his face a mask of regret and shame. He reached for her hand again, but she pulled away sharply, as though his touch might burn her. His eyes pleaded with her for forgiveness, but Isabella couldn't even bring herself to look at him. Instead, she glanced at the woman standing beside him, the woman who had, in an instant, destroyed the life Isabella had imagined for herself. The woman's face was filled with sorrow, but there was no excuse for the pain she had caused. "Isabella, please," Michael whispered, his voice breaking. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've betrayed you in the worst possible way. But please, don't let this be the end of us." Isabella took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. "The end of us," she repeated, her voice rising, filled with raw emotion. "How could you think there could be an us after this? How could you think I could ever look at you the same way again?" Her words were sharp, but they came from a place of deep hurt. She had been so sure of their love, so certain that their future together was meant to be. And now, everything she had built her hopes and dreams around had crumbled in an instant. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, had betrayed her in the most painful way possible. She had given him her heart, and he had shattered it. Michael took a step forward, his eyes welling with tears. "Isabella, I love you," he said desperately. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never meant for any of this to happen. Please, just give me a chance to make things right." Isabella took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, to find her voice amidst the swirling storm of emotions. She had thought she would walk down this aisle to marry the man she loved, but now, all she felt was emptiness. The pain of his betrayal was like a sharp knife, cutting into the very core of her being. But in that moment, as she stood there facing him, she realized something profound. She realized that her life, her happiness, was not dependent on him. It never had been. The realization hit her like a wave, and for the first time since the truth had been revealed, Isabella felt a flicker of strength in her heart. She could feel her own resilience rising to the surface. She was more than this moment, more than the pain, more than the betrayal. She was strong. She was worthy of more than this. She turned away from Michael, her voice steady, though it cracked with emotion. "No, Michael," she said softly but firmly. "You've made your choice, and I'm not going to be part of this. I deserve someone who loves me fully, someone who is honest with me, someone who doesn't keep secrets. You can't give me that. And I can't stay here, pretending everything is okay when it's not." Michael's face crumbled as he heard her words. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Isabella didn't need to hear any more apologies. The truth was clear, and there was nothing left for them to fix. She had been living in a dream, but now she was awake. The fantasy was gone, and the reality was painful but necessary. The priest, who had been silently witnessing the unfolding drama, stepped forward, his voice gentle but full of understanding. "Isabella, you are making the right decision. Sometimes, the most painful moments are the ones that lead us to the most powerful growth. What you're doing right now is not an end, but a beginning. A beginning of something better, something more authentic. You are not bound by the mistakes of others. You are free to create the life you deserve." Isabella turned toward the priest, her eyes filled with gratitude. She had always trusted him to guide people in their spiritual journeys, but today his words gave her something even more precious: permission to choose herself, to walk away from the pain and step into her own future, unburdened by someone else's betrayal. As she took a deep breath, The weight that had been pressing down on her chest began to lift. She could feel her strength returning, piece by piece, as if she were reclaiming the parts of herself that had been lost in the illusion of love. She was no longer the victim in this story. She was the hero, the one who had the power to move on. With a final look at Michael, who stood there with his head hung low, Isabella made her decision. "I'm done, Michael," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I deserve more than this. I will not settle for a life that is built on lies. I am leaving, and I am starting over." The guests, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, began to murmur among themselves. Some were shocked, others were moved by Isabella's courage. But the priest, who had witnessed the moment of her liberation, nodded in silent approval. Isabella was no longer a bride in waiting. She was a woman taking control of her destiny. Without another word, Isabella turned and walked down the aisle. It wasn't the path she had imagined, but it was the one she needed to take. As she walked, she felt lighter, freer, as though each step was shedding the weight of her past. The doors of the church opened in front of her, and the light from the outside world poured in, signaling the beginning of a new chapter. Isabella stepped outside, the air fresh and cool against her skin. She was alone, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of peace. Her heart was still broken, but it was no longer bound to the past. It was open to the future, to new possibilities, and to the love she would find within herself. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. And as the door to the church closed behind her, Isabella knew that no matter what the future held, she would never stop believing in herself.